In this first orientation lecture, I want to talk a bit about what archaeology is and how it works, what it can and cannot do, and all of this with particular reference to American-style biblical archaeology. And I want to say a little bit about the history of that movement, about the developments in the last generation or so, and give you a kind of state-of-the-art notion of where we are today. In the beginning, let me clarify that when I use the term Palestine or Palestinian, I use it without reference to the modern political situation. I have an opinion about that, but it's none of your business. And when I talk about Bible, I mean mostly the Hebrew Bible, or what you perhaps would call the Old Testament. And I may use BC or BCE without explaining further. Now, what is archaeology? There are as many definitions as there are archaeologists. One friend of mine has said an archaeologist is someone with his eye to the peephole of the past, trying to pry into the minds of the ancients. But in fact, as another colleague, Lou Binford, reminds us, archaeologists are poorly equipped to be paleopsychologists. Another wag has said an archaeologist is someone who spends his life poking through other people's garbage. I like to say that archaeologists are merely historians who write history from things rather than from text, although we're glad to have text if we can find them. In other words, let's put the stress on material culture, on things rather than words. And I want to try to help you to understand how an archaeologist reads artifacts in the same way that a historian would read texts. If you know the language and syntax and vocabulary of things, then they speak to you with a very loud and clear voice. So we are materialists, we archaeologists. Now, biblical archaeology really isn't an American invention. It began perhaps as early as about 1838 when an American scholar, Edward Robinson, went to Palestine as the first modern explorer. He was, of course, a biblical scholar and taught at what is now Andover and Newton Seminary in Boston. He went again in 1852. By the 1870s, the British and other Europeans were deeply involved in the recovery of the ancient Near East, and the first modern maps of the area were made, particularly by the Great Survey of Western Palestine under British auspices. The first real excavation was in 1898 at Tel El Hessi, a small site near the Gaza Strip, carried out by the legendary Sir William Flinders Petrie. I'm so old now that some people think I'm Petrie, but I'm really not. In any case, that was the beginning, and of course it was thought to be a biblical site, either Eglon or perhaps Lachish. In the golden years before the First World War, not only the Americans but others were involved in the first large-scale excavations. The British at Gezer, where I've spent more than 30 years re-excavating the site and where my students carry on today. The Americans excavated at Samaria, the capital of the Northern Kingdom, under George Andrew Reisner of Harvard. The Germans excavated at Jericho. These are all famous biblical sites. So what we're dealing with is the archaeology of the Holy Land, or the lands of the Bible. That was the initial impetus and interest, and in some circles it still is today. Now, I want to call particular attention to the works of W.F. Albright, who was the teacher of all of my teachers, one of the greatest Orientalists of the past century, a man of formidable talent and industry. It was really Albright who invented American-style biblical archaeology. And he spent many years as director of the Jerusalem School, now named for him, which it was my honor to direct later on. Let me give you a typical definition of biblical archaeology, or archaeology as Albright understood it, from 1966. I shall use the term biblical archaeology here to refer to all Bible lands, from India to Spain, and from southern Russia to South Arabia, and the whole history of those lands from about 10,000 BC or even earlier to the present time. Well, if archaeology is all of that, then it's really nothing. This is not a definition. It doesn't make any distinctions. One of Albright's principal protégés was George Ernest Wright, of blessed memory, my own teacher at Harvard. Now, Wright was not only a distinguished Palestinian archaeologist who directed the excavations at Shechem, where I began, another biblical site, but he was also Parkman Professor of Divinity in the Harvard Divinity School and a noted Old Testament scholar. So for Americans, the combination of archaeology and biblical studies was natural. It had been from the beginning. and very few questioned it because of the way that Albright and his students dominated the field. Now, the heyday of biblical archaeology was probably in the 1950s and 60s after the Second War. Ernest began his excavations at Shechem, and there I began in 1962 under his tutelage. Not far away at LG, Biblical Gibeon, James Pritchard was excavating for the University of Pennsylvania. His title was Professor of Religious Thought. Paul Lapp was excavating at Tanakh and elsewhere, a Lutheran clergyman. And in fact, virtually all of the Americans excavating in that period were biblical scholars, mostly Old Testament scholars, mostly ordained. Joseph Calloway from Southern Baptist Seminary was excavating at Ai, another biblical site in those days. Even the Europeans were choosing biblical sites. Dame Kathleen Kenyon at Jericho, representing the British, of course. The Europeans were not as deliberate in their connection of these two fields as the Americans were. Few of them were clerics, and most of them had no theological interest. I knew Kenyon well in her latter years, and I used to tease her a bit. She once read the Bible, but didn't like it. And she certainly didn't like American clergymen. She told me once, the trouble with Ernest Wright is he's very low church, you know. She was an Anglican, more or less. So in the 50s and 60s, there seemed to no reason to question the success of what Albright once called the archaeological revolution that will change the way we understand the Bible forever. Now, however, by the 1960s, things were changing. Questions were being raised. I came on the scene myself in 1966, freshly out of Harvard, determined to change the field. And I began to challenge my own teachers and to challenge the notion of biblical archaeology. I had no idea of the mischief I was getting into, but it seemed to me that it was time for change. Where have we heard that again recently? But to show you how far we had to go, I want to give you a couple of quotes from the literature of an earlier generation, because in that earlier period of biblical archaeology, it really was thought by almost everybody that archaeology would prove the Bible. That is, prove my views of how the Bible is true. Here, for instance, from my book, The Problem of the Old Testament in 1906, is a quotation by James Orr. "It must be accounted a wonderful providence of God that at a time when so much is being said and done to discredit the Old Testament, so marvelous a series of discoveries bearing directly on matters contained in its pages should be made. A new claimant to be heard has put in its voice in the science of archaeology, which bids fair before long to control both criticism and history." This was in the days of the origins of higher criticism, a crisis which provoked the fundamentalist modernist controversy that split almost every American Protestant denomination, and Judaism as well. Or here's another quote from a wonderful book, 1933, "The Spade and the Bible, Archaeology Supports the Old Book." Newton says, "Not a ruined city has been opened up that has given any comfort to unbelieving critics or evolutionists. Every find of archaeologists in biblical lands has gone to confirm Scripture and to confound its enemies. Not since Christ ascended back to heaven have there been so many scientific proofs that God's Word is true." That's a wonderful sermon, but some of us were no longer converts. Now, I want to say a little bit about what happened to change things. First of all, biblical archaeology died in the 1970s. I've often been accused of killing it because I was one of the first to write in opposition to classical style biblical archaeology. I always say I'm flattered. I didn't have that much influence. I only observed its passing and wrote its obituary. But the movement was weak already from within. First of all, it was amateurish. As I've already said, almost all the practitioners were not archaeologists at all. They were biblical scholars. They were theologians and clerics. When I began at Shechem in 1962, all of us were seminarians or seminary professors. Most of us were ordained clergy. There were no clergy women in those days. Later on, we began to decide we had to specialize in archaeology and make a choice. And most of us gradually left theological studies and left the ministry. I used to say we were not defrocked, just unsuited. And so we moved on to other things. Not only that, but the agenda of biblical archaeology was biased from the beginning. Its aim really was to prove the Bible, in this case, a kind of mainstream Protestant Old Testament interpretation of the Bible. And I'd like to use the word parochial for the movement. It was very narrow. It was not a branch of archaeology at all. It was a branch of biblical studies. In fact, I will share with you a definition of Ernest Wright, my own teacher, which is similar to Albright's definition, and here's what Ernest said. To me, at least, biblical archaeology is a special armchair variety of general archaeology, which studies the discoveries of the excavators and gleans from them every fact that throws a direct, indirect, or even diffused light on the Bible. And he says its central and absorbing interest is the understanding and exposition of the Scriptures. So there you have it from the principal practitioners. But that's obviously a rather narrow definition of archaeology. And I think the word parochial in its dual meaning is appropriate. Now, the agenda of biblical archaeology failed. It did not succeed in proving the Bible true. And in fact, in these lectures, I will show you how archaeology has raised more questions than it has provided answers. In short, this is the revolution that failed. Not entirely. It succeeded in a different way, but in a way that Albright and Wright never anticipated, I think. First of all, we ought to say also that this kind of archaeology was imposed on the Middle East in a colonial era. And as we moved into the post-colonial era, the national schools in Israel and Jordan and elsewhere soon eclipsed foreign work altogether. This kind of archaeology did, however, grow enough to become complex and expensive. And, as a matter of fact, seminaries could no longer support the field work as they had done at Shechem and Gibeon and Ai and elsewhere, and we had to turn to new sources of secular funding. Now, when you go to government agencies or private foundations with a spade in one hand and a Bible in the other, you're not going to get much money. So we learned quickly to tone down the biblical language, and this had a powerful effect on what we were actually doing. We also began to experiment with field schools and attracting volunteers, student volunteers, rather than paid Arab labor. And students have a habit of asking some very embarrassing questions. They wanted to know why we were doing what we were doing, and the old answers weren't good enough. I think we probably learned more from our students at Gezer than we taught them, but we were the first to pioneer field schools using American student volunteers beginning already in 1964, and now you find it everywhere on American and foreign digs all over the Middle East. We were also experimenting with new methods. We were young Turks, I suppose, and we were trying out new ways of doing archaeology. Already we'd learned how to dig well, that is, to dig in a three-dimensional way. We learned that partly from Dame Kathleen Kenyon. This is sometimes called the bulk debris layer of excavation, and it was an advance. I don't want to deal with the technical aspects of fieldwork. I want to think rather of theory and of research and of results. As our digs became larger and more complex and we were asking new kinds of questions, we had to begin to employ people who did not come from our background. I remember the first time we employed a full-time geologist at Gezer. People thought, well, what is a geologist and what in the world could they possibly contribute? We had learned to separate red dirt from black dirt in a mechanical way, but the geologist told us why it was red or black and what it meant in terms of the cultural process. Soon we were employing paleoenvironmentalist, fluviatile geologist, geomorphologist, physical anthropologist, and before very long, of course, computer experts. And together with these new kinds of workers in the field and new equipment, new technologies, before long we realized that our discipline was changing, whether those changes were deliberate on our part or not. So what happened, I think, in the 1960s, particularly with the new American excavations at Gezer, which it was my privilege to direct under the supervision of Ernest Wright and Nelson Glick, we experienced what Thomas Kuhn, in his book, The Structures of Scientific Revolutions, would call a new paradigm, a new generation with a new way of doing things. These were heady days. I remember them very well. We were young, we thought we knew everything, and we were going to change the world. Well, we did, but not exactly in the ways that we thought. Now, what were the results of that revolution that I and others tried to mount back in the 60s and early 70s? Well, here are the watchwords that I coined at the time. I said, we must We must, after all, be specialized. It's no longer good enough to be generalist. To compete in the world of archaeology, we have to specialize in the archaeology of what we were then calling ancient Palestine, rather than the world of the Bible. And I argued that we had to be professional. It wasn't good enough to be amateurs, to be part-time professors who went out to the Holy Land in the summer, then came home and forgot about publishing. We had to be full-time, we had to be fully professional, we had to raise standards for field work and research and publication. And finally, I suggested with some trepidation that we had to secularize the field of biblical archaeology. The metaphor I used was coming of age. Our subdiscipline, once a part of biblical studies, was now ready to become an autonomous discipline on its own, fully mature and fully independent of its parents. Now, I argued for changing the name of the discipline to Syro-Palestinian archaeology. I didn't invent that term. Albright did, as an alternate term in the 30s. But I argued that biblical archaeology doesn't any longer describe what we're doing, for the most part, and that we ought to broaden the field and understand it as the archaeology of ancient Syria and ancient Palestine. Now, recently, we've had to give up that term because we have real Palestinian archaeologists now working in the West Bank, and I can hardly call myself accurately any longer a Palestinian archaeologist. So most of us are talking now about the archaeology of southern Levant, or simply the archaeology of Israel, the archaeology of Jordan, the archaeology of the West Bank, the archaeology of Syria. We're trying to find, again, neutral terminology. So the name change did not last, but the other changes did. And I think it's fair to say that today, biblical archaeology is really dead. There is a branch of our discipline that deals with the Bible, but mostly we will call it archaeology and biblical studies. The Israelis use the term, but only in English. They do not use it in Hebrew. It would sound very strange. In Hebrew, it would come out as something like the archaeology of Scripture, and that's not what the Israelis do. They are not religious. They're certainly not rabbis. For them, the Bible is simply the constitution of the modern state. They have no theological interest, as the classic founders of biblical archaeology had. So the term is still used, but it's a kind of shorthand and almost always in quotes, because the fact of the matter is today that the archaeology we do in Israel has perhaps little to do with biblical studies except peripherally. And believe me, in Jordan, nobody is interested in biblical archaeology, even less so in Syria. So it may disturb you to hear about these changes, but in fact they have taken place, and we cannot turn the clock back. Sometimes it's asked, who killed biblical archaeology? Its practitioners did, because their view was very myopic. Now, there was another thing that happened in the 60s and 70s particularly, and that is the dawn of something often called the new archaeology. If you want a turning point, it would probably be the seminal work by Watson, Redman, and LeBanc, published in 1971 as The New Archaeology, spelled without A-E, spelled just with E, The New Archaeology, an explicitly scientific approach. Now, the new archaeology, which burst on the scene in the 70s, affected us powerfully at Gezer, and we made another paradigm shift. Here are the main features of the American-style new archaeology. It was a turning away from what had been called culture history, or comparative typological sequences of pottery mostly, and regional histories, the sort of direct historical approach, and a call for a more anthropological approach. Less historical, more anthropological. A call for explicit theory. Archaeologists had not paid much attention to why they were doing what they were doing. They just did it. Now, larger, if you wish, philosophical questions were being raised. What is it you think you're doing? Spell it out for us. And of course, the scientific notion was that archaeology, like the hard sciences, should engage in hypothesis testing. You didn't just go to a site and start digging, because your seminary had certain interests, or your museum. You had to develop what was called research design, and then you would test these formulations that you had put forward. And of course, the methodology was drawn from particularly philosophy of science. Now, of course, to do this kind of archaeology, you really had to have multidisciplinary staff, so that became the new watchword. In other words, what you do has to be quantifiable if it's to be truly scientific. Sometimes this was called processual archaeology because the goal was not to reconstruct a historical sequence, but to talk about universal laws of the cultural process. Processual archaeology. Now already you may have some suspicion as to whether there are such laws, but at the time no one seemed to ask. It was assumed that you could prove that everywhere in all times and places the same kinds of cultural processes took place. In that case, then, ancient Palestine was just another test case for these universal laws. Now, many of us were mesmerized by the new archaeology and tried to borrow from it, although I hope critically. Now, there arose what we would call an epistemological interest. That is, how do you know what you think you know? Theories of knowledge now came to the fore, and more than ever, archaeologists began to ask, well, what is the meaning of the things you have excavated? So these were risky trends in some ways, but also stimulating, and the new archaeology had a considerable impact. Now, it never had great impact on Israeli archaeologists who are more pragmatic, still today. They're very good at what they do, but they're not much interested in theory. And they made fun of the new archaeology while we Americans were trying to practice it in the 70s, but gradually our interests have come closer together. Now, certainly the new archaeology had a powerful effect. I want to mention only briefly in passing that the new archaeology, surprise, surprise, soon became the old archaeology, and we have moved beyond that now in the 80s and 90s to what is sometimes called post-processual archaeology, a kind of rejection of some of the doctrinaire notions of the new archaeology. For instance, today there is widespread skepticism about whether there are any universal laws of the cultural process. Sometimes these are called Mickey Mouse laws. There are generalities that you can speak about, but they are certainly not laws in the sense that there are laws governing the physical universe. There was a kind of a return to history and to history writing after a period of 20 or 30 years, but it was recognized that we needed more field work, not necessarily more theory, but back to the dirt, new facts, new data, better data, and then perhaps we could raise some of these questions anew. Now, the new archaeology had dismissed ideology as a factor in cultural change. It was very materialistic, very mechanical in a way. But the post-processual archaeologists argued that ideology was often a major factor in cultural change, including religion. History and religion had become sort of bad words, and now it was possible to speak about them again. This was refreshing to most of us who had started with these things in mind. Now, it was in the 1980s that Ian Hodder, a British archaeologist, developed the notion of reading material culture. And he argued that you can read a pot in the same way that a textual scholar can read a text. Many biblical scholars were fond of saying archaeology is mute. It's silent because it doesn't give you the names of individual actors. But that doesn't matter very much. Now, I've often experimented with this. I will take a pot to a seminar and pass it around, and I will ask people, what does the pot say to you? It doesn't say anything. You can hold it up to your ear, you can smell it, you can rub it, you can do whatever you want to. It's not going to talk to you. You can turn it over on the bottom. There's no label. It doesn't say what it means. Now give me the pot, and I will give a semester-long course. Because I know the language of material culture, the syntax, the vocabulary. It speaks powerfully to me. I can tell you where that pot was made, how it was made, when it was made, who made it, what it was intended for, how it got broken, how it was reused, how it ended up on the garbage heap. All of that I can tell you, even if I don't know the name of the potter. Doesn't make much difference. So archaeology is not silent, it is not mute, but one has to learn how to ask the right questions and then to hear the answers. So today it's very common to speak about reading material culture in the same way that biblical scholars read text. And by the way, the same problems of interpretation are involved, the same hermeneutic, we might say. And above all, the post-processualists began to talk about meaning, the meaning of things, in the same way we had talked about the meaning of texts. So nowadays, we are asking what I would call bigger questions. And here, I think, are some of the big questions in archaeology today. Not the old-fashioned kinds of questions the biblical archaeologists were asking, but truly philosophical questions, universal questions like these. How do we know the past? Do we, in fact, know anything reliable about the past. And an even bigger question, who owns the past? How is our understanding of the past created? To whom does the past belong? And what modern uses is it legitimate to make of the past? And finally, of course, the endless question, what do we learn from the past? I'm afraid the answer is not very much. Not very much. If we had known the past of the Middle East, we wouldn't have gotten involved the way we have. So these are the questions, the imponderables that motivate archaeology and archaeologists today. Now, I want to turn finally to a new challenge that has arisen. If the post-processualist began to focus on history again in the 70s already, but particularly up through the 90s, biblical scholars who had once been our colleagues were beginning to turn away from history. There arose something called revisionism in the 1990s particularly, or a controversy between so-called maximalist and minimalist. Let me give you just a few books that have changed my own thinking. These are books by European revisionists, as they call themselves. At Copenhagen, there are several of them. Thomas L. Thompson wrote a book in 1999. Notice the titles, The Mythical Past, Archaeology and the Myth of Israel. His colleague, Niels Peter Lemke, the same year published a book entitled The Israelites in History and Tradition, but when he finished, there was only history and tradition, no Israelites. At Sheffield in England, a man named Davies wrote a little book in 92 that really started it all, In Search of Ancient Israel. He didn't find it, and in fact said it can't be found. There is really no historical Israel. And he argued there are three Israels, the historical Israel we can't reconstruct, and then there's ancient Israel, which modern scholars invented, mostly Israelis and Americans whom he doesn't like. And then there's, of course, biblical Israel, which the ancient rabbis invented. But it's all invented. Again, the key word is invented. And Keith W. Whitelam, who has gone to Sheffield now, wrote the most radical book in 1996, The Invention of Ancient Israel, The Silencing of Palestinian History. Now you see where this is going. It's all ideology. I use the term revisionist because that's what they first called themselves. Others call them minimalist. I've suggested they are perhaps in fact nihilists, because when they finish there really is nothing left. Now if you think I'm inventing this, I want to share some quotes from them. Here for instance is Lemke. By the way, they're all friends and colleagues. I've known them a long, long time. But Lemke has made a sort of 180-degree about face in his work, and today he says things like this, quote, modern scholars invented ancient Israel. Or another quote, the Israels of the Old Testament showed themselves to be a product of a literary imagination. Its history was not one of the real world, but in its organization was directed by the requirements of two foundation myths, the first of the Exodus and the second of the Babylonian exile. Whether or not parts of this history really happened in the real world is to the mind that formed this history immaterial. In other words, the biblical writers made it up, and that was good enough. That's all they were interested in, the myth. Or he says, at the end we have a situation where Israel is not Israel, Jerusalem not Jerusalem, and David not David. No matter how we twist the factual remains from ancient Palestine, the archaeological artifacts, we cannot have a biblical Israel that is at the same time the Israel of the Iron Age. And recently on the internet, he has said this, from an historian's point of view, ancient Israel is a monstrous creation. Now, when challenged, he says, well, by monstrous, I just meant larger than life. No, he meant ugly, ugly. Now, Davies has said this, every historian knows that history is not about the past at all, it's about the present. What is ostensibly an argument about history turns out to be an argument from sacred scriptures. And of course, he has branded me and others who criticized him as fundamentalists, galloping fundamentalists. I wrote to him once and said, I'm not even really a theist. And he said in the next thing he published, well, Deaver really is a theist, no matter what he says. And so was Marx. Really? I'm amazed. Not very good company to be in, but that's what he said. Now, Whitelum has written a book that is so pro-Palestinian that some have wondered whether it does not border on anti-Semitism. I'm not going to make a judgment, but here are some quotes from Whitelum's book, The Invention of Ancient Israel, The Silencing of Palestinian History. He says, Western scholarship has invented ancient Israel and silenced Palestinian history. This ancient Israel of biblical studies is a scholarly construct based upon a misreading of the biblical traditions and divorced from any historical reality. Biblical scholarship is not just involved in retrojective imperialism, it is collaborated in an act of the dispossession of the Palestinian people. He says the archaeology of ancient Israel has effectively confirmed for most scholars, he means Israelis, that the past belongs to Israel. And he says even that's an imaginative past. Now, Whitelum and I have had a long exchange of views in the literature, and I won't share with you all the names that I've been called, but the one that I like best is, Whitelum has recently said Deaver is guilty of facticity. He has found me out. He smoked me out at last. But you see, what is at issue here really is the question of whether there are any facts. And for the revisionists, there aren't. It's all ideology. Now, how do they arrive at this view? For them, the Hebrew Bible is all too late to be historical. These texts do not come from the Iron Age, say 1200 to 600 BC, the biblical period, of the monarchy. They are from the Persian period in the 5th and 4th century, or most will say from the Hellenistic period, the 3rd, 2nd century. In other words, these are stories written long after ancient Israel had been forgotten, and they have nothing to do with a real history in a real time and place. These texts are not historical at all. They are really foundation myths to establish a sense of Jewish identity against the Hellenistic inroads of the 2nd century BC, particularly in the Maccabean era. In other words, the Bible is nothing but a piece of religious propaganda. It is the greatest literary hoax of all time, and it fooled nearly everybody until these clever fellows figured it out about 15 years ago. Well, according to the revisionists then, there was no patriarchal era in history. There was no Mosaic age, no Moses. There was no Exodus and conquest at all. There were no early states, including Israel and Judah. There was no Yahwism, or the religions of ancient Israel. None of the prophets were actually living persons. They are all literary inventions of a later time. There was, in fact, no Israel. All of it is what the revisionists call a social construct. Now, if you know the language, you recognize where it comes from. It comes from postmodernism, a movement that's extremely difficult to identify. But in fact, it is sometimes called constructivism, because one of the favorite slogans of postmodernist philosophers is that all claims to knowledge are simply social constructs. In other words, we don't know anything. We make up a view of the past to suit whatever is convenient. We can make the past mean anything we want to. We can read a text any way we want to. All of this begins with what some of the gurus of the movement have called skepticism toward all meta-narratives. Now, in the West, what is the great meta-narrative, the larger-than-life story that makes us who we are in the Western cultural tradition? It is the Bible. So, the revisionists have in common with postmodernists the attempt to undermine the Bible as a claim that no longer can be regarded as legitimate in a postmodern world. The modernism they reject is the modernism of the Enlightenment. And behind that, the modernism of the classical and Christian early world where it all began. Now, the assumptions then of the revisionists are that you cannot do history at all. In 1997, a little book was published by a European seminar entitled, "Can a History of Israel Be Written?" And by and large, the answer is no, at least not a real history. So that kind of skepticism toward history poses a real problem for archaeologists, because if we're going to regard ourselves as historians, then we have no history to write. That would seem to put us out of business. Not exactly. Now, it seemed to me that the revisionists, having jettisoned the biblical text as useless, would then turn to archaeology, our only other source of knowledge of the ancient world. But they do not. Davies, in his little book, cites the basic handbook of archaeology. Amichai Mazar's book, Archaeology of the Holy Land, published before he wrote, in one footnote only, and he dismisses it because he says that book deals with the Iron Age and Israel is about the Hellenistic age. So he simply ignores, totally ignores the massive archaeological evidence that we have. Others of the revisionists attempt to use archaeology, but in such an amateurish and even slanderous way that it's really embarrassing. That's how I got involved. I don't care the mess they make of their own field, but when they muddle my field up, I've spent a lifetime trying to make archaeology an honest intellectual discipline, and I will not have it. And so for the last 15 years, we've engaged in a lot of verbal sparring. I think we're winning, but I'm not sure. Now, I do give the revisionists credit, and have from the beginning, for raising the question of historiography. That's what it's really about.